To discuss this, I'm joined from Canberra by Rod Little, the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. In Sydney, former politician David Oldfield, who's the co-founder of the Conservative One Nation Party. And in Melbourne, human rights lawyer Julian Burnside. I thank you all for joining us. Rod Little, let me begin with you. 10 years on from that apology, has much changed in Australia?
Well, I think not a lot has changed. There is a lot of intention and a lot of healing to be done, and I think there's much more to be done as well. So there's lots of hope and lots of expectations from the Parliament of Australia to do things that would assist with that healing.
Okay, Julian
but
Burnside.
No, not really.
Okay. So interestingly, let me then ask Julian Burnside, do you agree with that? Good intentions, but perhaps not properly fulfilled over the past decade?
I'm not sure I would go as far as to say there are good intentions. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was produced by Aboriginal leaders in the centre of Australia last year, 2017, was immediately canned by the government, who realised that as a political issue, Aborigines just don't count. Now, it's a scandal. It's a real stain on Australia's history. We need to get serious about it. I think our intentions need to improve.
But I mean, when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd came out and referred to a shameful national chapter in the country's history where these Indigenous children were forcibly taken away from their families and so on, it was emotional, it was from the heart. A lot of Indigenous Australians said they really appreciated that. So doesn't it sounds a little bit disingenuous from you, Julian, to say actually the intentions weren't good?
Oh, the intentions of Kevin Rudd's apology were excellent. And I think the apology really struck a chord which most people would not have expected. But there has not been any great follow-through. I mean, what Kevin Rudd said was exactly right, but it left out the first part of history, which is that Aborigines have a very, very close relationship with the land. They've lived in this country for 60,000 years. 230 years ago, we came in and we took the land from them. And that caused them terrible harm. We have only in recent years begun to notice that the connection between Aboriginal people and the land is closer, if anything, than the connection between Aboriginal people and their parents or their children. Anyway, having taken the land off them, we redoubled the damage by taking their children from them.
Right.
And that has caused immense harm.
Okay.
To Aboriginal people. We have not got a coherent plan to fix the harm.
Okay, so David Oldfield, there's no coherent plan to fix the harm, and the apology wasn't quite the apology that Julian wanted. What do you think?
Well, I don't think that there are very many Aboriginal people that will be happy with anything that's done. There's been a lot of money spent, and there has been a lot of good intention. There's also been a lot of politics over a very, very long period of time. We're talking decades and decades, even in the more recent period of, say, the last 30 years. There has been good intention. There's been a lot of work done. There's been a lot of money spent. But no matter how much of that takes place, there are always going to be Aboriginal people. Hopefully there won't be too many of them that feel this way, but there's always going to be Aboriginal people for whom there will never be enough. I mean, we do face a situation where over a long period of time, Aboriginal people have been sold this scenario where they own the land and we are occupying it. Now, I mean, that in reality is a nonsense. It really is. And Australia today is a very, very expansive and well-coordinated civilisation and is very valuable. The land that was stolen, or we would say colonised, back in 1788 was essentially worthless. Nobody wanted it, I suppose, except for the Aboriginal people themselves.
But why did
they weren't doing anything particularly with it apart from living on it.
Why did you make those inverted commas when you said stolen? I mean, colonisation is theft, isn't it? I mean, the vast majority of them were killed during this process. Why does it seem to be just a glib sort of throwaway line for you, David?
Well, because for me it was colonisation. And look, you
Imran,
could, perhaps in the context of history, you could say that it was theft.
Finish your point, David, and then Rod can respond.
Theft in the context of history, the same as you could say that the theft of every country has taken place by some group of people at some stage. For goodness sakes, my own ancestors in 1066 crossed the English Channel and took England away from the Saxons. Now, every country at some stage has changed hands pretty much by some group. What has to be understood is that for Aboriginal people to get on and do well in Australia, they need to focus on being Australians like everybody else, rather than clinging to the past.
David, if this program had existed in, say, the 13th century and there were Saxons who were terribly affected by that, we would undoubtedly be having this discussion. Let's go to Rod Little. Rod Little, you want to respond to David?
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty naive to get a history lesson from two, you know, respectful white people. I thought our conversation was about the apology to begin with, but also in recent weeks, closing the gap. 10 years on reflection of little achievement on both accounts. Now, I, for one, am a survivor of a stolen generations. My mother, myself, and my grandmother was taken from our families. And that was I was taken just 6 months after the '67 referendum. So don't presume, any non-Aboriginal people know how I feel and how my families feel about the hurt and the healing that needs to be done. So I think we need to focus on the question that you posed is about the apology, and that is in the last 10 years, what we had expected to improve and to be working with people, not to make assumptions and assume that we need to get over it and get on with it, because I think that's been totally disrespectful and rude.
Okay, so David, here's a man speaking from the heart and speaking from experience.
Well, Imran, I don't particularly mind whoever that person is from the First Nations thinking it's disrespectful. That's his view. It's not a matter of being disrespectful. It's a matter of facing the facts. And I've had a lot to do with Aboriginal people. And by the way, whoever you are, you always presume that I am white. Well, I'm mostly white, but I'm also part Maori.
David,
and my wife
are we playing a game
is part American Indian.
Oh, come on, David, are we playing a game here?
So I'm sick of
in
this
the context,
game, this BS.
So David, a couple things here.
This BS game.
Okay, David, a couple things. David, a couple things.
This BS game
in the context of this discussion
against non-white.
Okay, David.
I'm about as much Maori as most Aborigines are Aboriginal.
Okay, so for the context of this discussion, you yourself said we colonized Australia. You're a white man in the context of this discussion. Secondly, his name is Rod Little. Rod Little is talking to you, and I think it would probably be the respectful thing to, I guess, just, you know, acknowledge his existence for the sake of this discussion. For the context of this discussion, you're a white man, and his name is Rod Little.
Sadly, I didn't get his name at the beginning of this because I can't hear you very well, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But sorry, go on.
Okay, so he's saying that the Indigenous peoples of Australia are not included in this discussion. And you're saying they're just ungrateful because you're giving them everything, and there's no level of amount of things that you can give them that will make them happy. Don't you feel a little bit ashamed of yourself? Because here's a man saying, hey, I'm a part of the conversation here. We haven't done enough, and we're not meeting these targets. So please, let's have this discussion.
The difficulty is that Aboriginal people keep separating themselves, and it's not really their fault. A lot of white people get involved in this, and they separate Aboriginal people from everybody else. Aboriginal people need to get on with being Australians and not be too fussed about being Aboriginal. We need to be a country that is moving the same direction altogether. Now, I don't blame Aboriginal people for that circumstance because they're largely misled by so-called well-meaning white people who are not helping anybody. There's been lots of money spent, there's been lots of politics, there's been lots of talk, but the bottom line is Aboriginal people themselves need to engage in getting on with their lives and doing things for themselves.
Let me ask
the
Julian.
Same as every other Australian has to get up every day and do things for themselves.
So there was some shade thrown at Julian there. Let me ask you, Julian, how you feel about the notion that you're a so-called well-meaning white person misleading Aboriginal people by trying to, I guess, speak up for them.
I don't know that Julian is that. I don't even know Julian.
I am a white person.
I'm not suggesting he is that at all.
No. And I do hope I'm well-meaning. I'd rather be well-meaning than ill-meaning. I don't know where that places David Oldfield. Incidentally, can I go back one step, Imran? I thought the apology was terrific. I thought the apology was terrific. Unfortunately, the country has not implemented anything to follow through what the apology might have seemed to promise. The reason I made my point earlier about us taking the land from them, which is a historic fact, and taking their children from them, which is a historic fact, the point about that is that that caused them immense harm. And governments come along and they have programs that will last a couple of years. And as David Oldfield has pointed out a number of times, a lot of money's been spent, but it's been spent on short, quick fixes. What we need is a government that will say, we recognise that there are generations of very, very seriously damaged Aboriginal people. We were part of the problem and we are going to spend a generation addressing the problem. I mean, at the moment, the fact is that proportionally, Aborigines are the most incarcerated people in the world. Their children are disproportionately alienated from their families. Now, is it possible that what we have done to them is part of the cause of that? We need to stand back and address that sort of question and do it respectfully, but we need to make genuine attempts to restore the position in society which Aborigines are capable of occupying. They represent 600,000 members of our community. David Oldfield wants them all just to become Australian. That's all very well and good, but let's fix up the damage which we caused.
And as we look forward, Rod Little, the metrics don't look good, as Julian had mentioned, right? So poverty rates, incarceration rates, and so on. So we have these close the gap targets from the government. The government itself is admitting that it's not meeting those targets. Tell me how you would actually fix those problems. Is it, I don't know, reparations? Is it some other form of compensation? How do you actually close that gap without, I guess, the white majority feeling they're being trampled upon in some way?
Yeah, look, I really appreciate Julian's sort of capturing of that and reflecting on the efforts, and also David, of the investment. But it's not always about the money. It is about how do others let go and enable us, because we are growing sophisticated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our intelligence is probably, in a lot of cases, from lessons learned on how to do things. There is, as I said about privilege earlier, there is a perception that non-Aboriginal people need to do things for us and to us, which is a problem of the past, and that is thing. So the cycle of politics and the cycle of governments always change, but Aboriginal people, all Australians, to emphasise that point, that live in poverty and are not having sufficient housing. So their fundamental human rights are being violated across the board. Now, we as Aboriginal peoples and other peoples of the world have fundamental rights to a nationality. Australian is not a nationality. We want identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like First Nations peoples around the world. Now that is a fundamental right. The other thing is that we, as Julian has pointed out, there has been successive governments. You know, since 1967, we've had over a dozen prime ministers and something close to 21 ministers for Indigenous affairs. Now, you think that over that period of time, in 50 years, that we might have got something right, or if there was an acknowledgement that, gee, we've got the wrong approach here, but it's the rhetoric of the approach and what we've put, you know, with this report in the last the last day or so, saying that there's been a turnaround in 12 months where we're back on track. But there's 10 years, of failure. So the 10-year-old born today is looking towards another 10 years of something that's going to be looking like the same approach. What we're proposing, that there is a very clear partnership. And look, again, I've got to agree with you, Julian, the inaction from the very beginning, from the apology, and let's not forget the Close the Gap Steering Committee, which also is made up of non-Indigenous professionals across the sector, and again, there's failings there. So we've got to come at it a different approach, and that's what we're proposing.
And you've
leading,
listed
and governments and officials listening.
Yeah, and you've proposed a list of things here, kind of holistically. David Oldfield, a lot of this is sort of folded into people wanting to change the date when they want to change Australia Day, and just a general trend of momentum of people wanting to listen more to the concerns of the Indigenous peoples of Australia. What's so wrong about that?
There's nothing wrong with anybody having input, but of course the input has to have meaning and context. And when it comes to changing the date of Australia Day and all these sorts of things, I mean, that's tinkering around the edges. It doesn't put another doesn't put another Aboriginal Australian in a job. It doesn't take another Aboriginal Australian out of a jail or take another one out of a hospital or give anybody better care. I've seen a lot of young Aboriginal children doing very well in one or two schools that are doing a great job in outback Australia. But messing around with dates and messing around with wanting to have a nationality when they don't feel themselves Australian and these sorts of things. I mean, I was horrified to hear a moment ago when it was suggested that Aborigines want their own identity. Well, Aborigines seem more than happy to take the money of the Australian taxpayer, but what are you suggesting? They don't want to be Australians. This is Australia. If somebody doesn't want to be in Australia and doesn't want to be an Australian, then leave.
Well, just a reminder, they were there. They were there at the very beginning. They were there at the very beginning. Rod Little, final response from you.
Well, but Imran, they weren't there at the very beginning.
Where were they?
Vastly many years ago, ancestors were here. Their ancestors were here. No Aboriginal person living in Australia realistically has any more rights than any other person, be Aboriginal or not.
Okay.
Whether you came here 5 years ago from Turkey and you're now a citizen, you should have the same rights as an Aboriginal person who can trace his family back
we can go back
few hundred years.
Okay, we can go as far back as Pangea.
Australians into different people.
Okay, this is interesting because we could go back as far back as Pangea. Nobody comes from anywhere, really. Rod Little, final response from you because we're running out of time.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing. That's the other thing anyway. The Australians, Aborigines didn't come from Australia. They arrived in Australia earlier than other people, at the same time as people arrived in New Guinea. But, those are things that are just anthropological matters. If Australian Aborigines want to improve matters for themselves, they have to do a fair bit more for themselves.
Your concerns, Rod, are anthropological. Get over it and get on with your lives. That's basically what David's saying. Go ahead, respond, Rod.
Well, that's what I'm saying to David. Exactly the same. Get over it, get yourself educated, and then have a listen. Sit down and have a listen to us, because where your point of view and your world view comes from a central, prejudiced world view. And I think I'll leave it there.
Appreciate you taking the time to come on to the Newsmakers.
Thank
I've got
you,
a wrap.
Julian.
Rod Little, Julian Burnside, and David Oldfield. Thanks again.